And good evening, everybody. I am John O'Loughlin. Welcome once again to my channel. It's called McDuff Lives, and so happy to have David Cranmer Underdown back with us tonight. So, welcome, David. How are you tonight?
I'm doing good. Thanks for having me back, John.
Okay. Hey, I've been watching your Twitter once again, as I can tell you. I really highly recommend folks who do this. Um, I'm going to start off tonight with kind of taking a hold of the agenda because I want to talk about Dr. Rick Bright. And Dr. Rick Bright was the head of BARDA under the National Institutes of Health, and that's like the health version of DARPA. So you can imagine they try to think of all the craziest, wildest, long shot, remedies for the worst possible diseases and all the possible variations of it. I mean, it's a frighteningly large mandate that they have at BARDA. But anyway, this guy named Dr. Rick Bright has really got my attention in the past month or so. And the reason is for me, and if you have a chance, even if you don't, make sure and watch Mark Kulak's work on uh, Dr. Peter McCulloch and Dr. Bright and Dr. Malone that he's been publishing. He's very, very adamant about how Dr. Malone is kind of a poison pill among those presented at Senator Johnson's hearing. Whereas we have a number of heroic doctors, such as Peter McCulloch, that need to be promoted and protected. And I think this Dr. Zelenko, who I want to refer to tonight, is possibly another one. I can't vouch for him because I haven't studied him in detail. But he happens to be the doctor that President Trump got a letter from recommending that Trump use ivermectin. I'm not ivermectin, hydrochloroquine, if I've said that correctly, HCQ, which was promptly shut down. And who shut it down? Well, none other than Rick Bright. So I had a chance to study Dr. Bright a little bit, but you started in on him today with a Twitter feed that I absolutely have gone to share with the folks. Hang on a second while I put it up there, and please indulge me for a moment as I try to show
They're kind of long.
David's Twitter feed today. Yeah, I just want to get a taste for it. Okay, hang on. It's okay. Here we go. All right. Rick Bright, Wikipedia. In 2002, sassy Southern gent Ricky earned a PhD in immunology and molecular pathogenesis, that is virology, from the Division of Biological and Biomedical Sciences at the Emory University School of Medicine. His dissertation was titled, and then that's oh, I'm sorry, I have to go to the real page to open that. Studies on pathogenicity and control of H5N1 influenza A viruses in mice. His doctoral advisor was Jacqueline Katz. Marcus had some things to say about Dr. Katz, the Australian American microbiologist serving as the deputy director of the influenza division at the National Center for Immunization. Immunization, that's the name of the game, and respiratory diseases. Um, I'll skip down. Where's the next one? Oh, here we go. The next one. From 1997 to 2000, Sassafras Rick Bright worked at Emory University Department of Microbiology and in the Vaccine Research Center at Yerkes National Primate Center. We know Yerkes and Emory and the CDC are all connected.
Mhm.
Let's see. Okay, well, I could go on, but I found your characterization to be just absolutely on point, and in order to make that point, I'm now going to share a different screen, which I'm going to show this little video, and this video involves Dr. Rick Bright at the beginning, and you remember David's characterization as we play this. Oh, sorry. Try and start that over with the actual sound.
A little bit about how chloroquine and hydroxychloroquine first came into your point of view.
You know,
How did this first come up?
I wish I'd never heard of chloroquine and hydroxychloroquine. Honestly,
It is known as a malaria drug, and it's been around for a long time. And it's shown very encouraging, very encouraging early results.
I believe it was March 23rd. I got a call from Secretary Azar's chief counsel. The White House wanted us to move quickly on making this drug available.
At my direction, the federal government is working to help obtain large quantities of chloroquine.
I called my scientific team in BARDA, and they said, no way. There was no data to support that they had any benefit against the coronavirus. They pushed back, but Dr. Kadlik reiterated that directive to us and said, get on it, get it done. We came up with the option of an emergency use authorization. We could put boundaries in it. Restrict the drug to only be used in people who are hospitalized. And I was proud of our team for coming up with that compromise that we thought would protect Americans.
Have you ever heard of a Dr. Zelenko?
Yes.
According to the FDA, anecdotal reports suggest that these drugs may offer some benefit.
There was not a scientific reason to push either one of those drugs. The reason they were pushing them so hard was because the president was claiming that they were a miracle drug. Someone had given him this advice.
I happen to be taking it. I'm taking it, hydroxychloroquine. Right now, yeah.
Did you hear what he said afterwards? I received a letter
From a doctor the other day from Westchester, New York, around the area. He didn't want anything. He just said, sir, I have hundreds of patients, and I give them hydroxychloroquine.
So that was a letter I sent to the president.
But I thought it was a very well-crafted letter by a man who's a respected doctor.
He said it was a well-crafted letter.
It was about 6 days after that EUA. I woke up to an email string that had our Assistant Secretary for Health, our Director of FEMA, our ASPR, Dr. Kadlik, and the FDA all saying we need to flood the streets of New York and New Jersey with that drug as quickly as possible. And in that email discussion, someone was brave enough. They said, but wait a minute. The EUA says for hospitalized patients only. They said, no, it needs to go into the pharmacies. It needs to go out everywhere. The EUA doesn't matter. Push the drug out now.
If this drug works, it will be wonderful. It'll be so beautiful. It'll be a gift from heaven.
I lost it. I lost all respect for that chain of command, for that security that we as Americans have put in those people. And that is the moment I decided to break protocol.
When President Trump issued an executive order that every American should have access to hydroxychloroquine, that order was given to Secretary Azar. Secretary Azar gave that order to Larry Kudlow, who was the head counsel for Health and Human Services. Larry Kudlow called Dr. Rick Bright from the HHS, who was the head of BARDA, B-A-R-D-A, prime branch involved in vaccine research. How do I know all this? Dr. Bright himself, in his own words, says this in a documentary called Totally Under Control. I was in this documentary, and the segment right before mine, Dr. Bright speaks, and he gleefully admits to and walks through the mechanics of genocide. So, in his own words, it'd be worth your while to review it. So what does he say? He says the following, that he and his team at BARDA did not agree with the president's directives. So they came up with a creative solution where instead of using the right to try pathway that the government had established, or the compassionate access care program, which essentially gives access to patients to medication outside of clinical trials under certain circumstances. Senator Ron Johnson was the one that advocated for this legislation. Instead of using that pathway, which would have made hydroxychloroquine accessible to every American in the outpatient setting, they crafted an emergency use authorization that restricted hydroxychloroquine access to hospitalized patients. I'll say that again. The President of the United States gave an order that every single American should have access. By the way, when the President of the United States announced that he's taking hydroxychloroquine, he mentioned that he got a letter from a doctor from upstate New York advising him. So that was my letter. And so I had influenced the president's thinking when it came to the efficacy and safety of hydroxychloroquine to such a degree that he himself was willing to take it. And he felt that every single American should have access. And by the way, I've noticed whatever the FDA decides, the rest of the world follows. So in a sense, we had an opportunity to scale hydroxychloroquine, early pre-hospital treatment globally. This would have ended the stuff.
All right, I'm going to stop it there. Apologize for the lousy audio. I think this is a copy of a copy that obviously comes from the Rainer Fuhrmich Stiftung Corona Ausschluss, or the Corona investigation that he's running. But you get the point. Dr. Zelenko is saying that according to Dr. Rick Bright's action, the recommendation that President Trump ordered really that everybody have access to this medication as a choice was overruled, and in what he called a compromise facetiously, because we know, and Dr. Zelenko, if we were to play the whole thing, would explain this to you. But you can see what happens is if you don't use it in early treatment, then you end up with more severe disease, and that's where you end up in the hospital and getting subjected to worse interventions. So, all right, let me take him off of the screen and bring David back. So, David, this serious stuff. What I see is a war going on in our health policy, and to I think take a few shots at a guy like Rick Bright is fair, because if this is true, and I think it is, then what he did was to stop the intervention with a very effective medication that would have saved, how many hundreds and thousands of lives, and more importantly to me, I think would have prevented us from having a lockdown of our economy and destroying so much even worse than the disease itself. Okay, so that's you started it by putting that up on Twitter today. So I wanted to fill it in and let everybody know how I feel about it. I feel that this Rick Bright is, one of these guys, children of Satan. What do you think?
Well, I really am very grateful to be able to watch Mark Kulak's work on this, because it really and also George, it has been, very helpful in trying to sort of explain the groundwork. It seems like what the goal was they wanted to create a situation based on the language of the Emergency Act, and also Bright was one of the panelists that a lot of people have seen at the Milken Institute, where they talk about the need to usher in a new era of medication using mRNA. Bright's dream seems to be able to manufacture medication sort of at on basically designer custom medication based on the situation. And what Mark has talked a lot about is the need to fulfill the novel factor, where none of the medicine is effective in treating it, and that we're in new ground, and that because of this unique crisis, we need to abandon the established rules of testing and authorization for new drugs. And it seems that the big push with Dr. Malone was to prove that everything wasn't effective. Therefore, we need to use the remdesivir based on the Snohomish County man. Again, there's no information. We don't know who he is. We have to protect his privacy. But based on his favorable, treatment from the remdesivir, that was enough to create an emergency authorization for that drug. So, as far as Bright goes, I mean, with all the sassy stuff, like I have to say that when I watch this stuff, I really feel like a lot of the characters, I was somebody that loved to watch Saturday Night Live when I was growing up. Like, I went to this camp in Vermont, and I always felt like the kids from New England, like the New Yorkers and Boston and Connecticut, were so sophisticated, and they always knew, like, they told us to watch Saturday Night Live. So we'd watch that as a family growing up. And there was this character that Dana Carvey played, where he was the effeminate heterosexual character. And that's who I kind of Bright reminds me of, sort of that Southern guy. But he, his background is tough, because you've got the UAB background, which is the same as Callahan, University of Alabama in Birmingham, which of course I had a really bright classmate. I mean, I've been over this many times. My high school was loaded with the smartest, most outstanding students you could think of. They were incredible. And one of many really smart ones, he ended up going to UAB for his medical. And being a sports fan, I always knew that the top orthopedic is at UAB. So it has a big reputation, especially amongst sports fans. But, he ends up at the CDC, which is in Atlanta. Another intrigue for me always is that Sanjay Gupta, who is the CNN, lead medical advisor, he's an alumni of my high school. And he went to Country Day, where I went, and then he went to the University of Michigan Interflex program, which is very competitive. They don't have it anymore, but it's for it's basically an undergraduate and a medical graduate program in one, and it's very selective, and they don't take that many people for it. But again, with my high school, there were always a couple kids that went into that program, and his professor at University of Michigan was Dr. Francis Collins. So there's all these, I hate making things about, my background or my life and experience, but there are these intrigues to me that I think are really material. So Bright is at CDC. He goes to BARDA, which is basically, as you said, is like the DARPA program. It's for, it also, I think, really falls into this nuclear threat initiative program, which includes nuclear, biological, and chemical terrorism. And he then, after this kind of fallout that we see, he ends up at the Rockefeller, not the brothers, but just the regular Rockefeller Foundation.
Yeah.
And I know with your dad being classmates with several of the Rockefellers, they're a really interesting group. And if you go down the long stream of after I get through all the Malone most interesting man stuff, I get into the Rockefeller Foundation and its connections with United Fruit and the whole I forget the name of the Tacoma medical facility that's associated with the Joint Base in Tacoma that Vindman was supposed to be sort of managing, but it's named after the deputy Surgeon General, and again I can't remember the guy's name, but he was the Surgeon General that was overseeing the Tuskegee syphilis testing, the Guatemalan testing, but also what hits home for me is the Terre Haute, Indiana testing, and he oversaw those whole programs. And I know you're a student of the CIA, so about PB Success, which was the overthrow of Guatemala with the United Fruit Company. So you have this Rockefeller Foundation sponsored medical syphilis testing going on in concert with PB Success in Guatemala. So that also has intrigue with Edward Bernays being the propagandist that was doing influence operations and helping sort of steering the media blitz as far as conditioning the people to accept the coup. But there was also the Inter-America program that was run by Nelson Rockefeller, which was a intelligence operation that was partnered with the SOE, with the British intelligence. So there's a lot of intrigue with the connections between United Fruit Company, with the Dulles brothers at Sullivan and Cromwell, and State Department with John Foster. But then you also have the British side. And I think it really ties it all into where we are now. So as much as I want to, make fun of Rick Bright for, wanting a, exciting moment to, make influenza sexy and, get everybody on board with changing the medicine, there's a lot of really dark history that also goes into it. So I do try to bring that into the Twitter as well too, have the light parts, but also really try to, draw out some of the, what I think are, material background information that really gives us strong footing to really question these people, because they're not coming from a history of helping people and of, wanting everybody to be healthy. There's alternative explanations for what this history is. And of course we can then go into the whole Operation Condor, which was basically described as a World War III in South America, with overthrowing different countries down in what they call the cone of South America. So it's a lot of it's uncomfortable for me because, again, like I just want to be able to influence my own family to be cautious and to, not do anything that could potentially make them less healthy. But it's hard, it's so much background information. So I just try to, keep learning it better and better so I can explain it and make it more, understandable, because it does really, the whole thing. I mean, I've been, really, upset about not the whole situation, like, everybody, a lot of people are, getting into, picking a side, which I really have never connected with. So it's hard, I just want to try to get the information out and not just sort of go with the PR spin. And so, yeah,
I found your man, Thomas Perrin, to American Physician and Public Health Service Officer. When I hear Public Health Service Officer, I tend to want to run away in the opposite direction from what we've seen. And appointed the sixth Surgeon General of the United States from 1936 to 48, oversaw the notorious Tuskegee syphilis experiment and the Guatemala syphilis experiment, and more details to follow. Yeah, it is very, very serious, and yeah, I appreciate absolutely that you're using a little bit of humor to coat a very, very difficult pill to swallow, which is I've been running into the word the unspeakable a lot. A famous book called The Unspeakable by James Douglas it describes the Kennedy assassination. And the idea is, that there is this evil that's so dark that we don't want to talk about it. And you can't explain where it comes from. And it just is like radioactive. You just recoil from thinking of things that are that dark. But they use that term in connection with the Kennedy assassination. But I think it is generally applicable to what they do to people. That they destroy families, they destroy whole towns, cultures, countries, and they do it as if they had a right to do it. They don't feel bad about it at all. It's like, yeah, we and speaking of the people of Guatemala, comparing to the people of the black subjects of that experiment, that involuntary experiment with syphilis in Tuskegee, they do consider them to be different races. That this is, these are in some respect lesser versions of humanity, and from time to time they get to do some experiments with them to see how things work in the human body, and they've justified themselves to do that. I read about the experiments that were done at Hartford Hospital when Richard Bissell Sr. was the president of it. They were doing lobotomies on people into the 50s, into the 1950s. This is experimental medicine with a scalpel, and it's talk about unspeakable evil. I think we come to face with it when we look into the dark logic of a Dr. Bright, who we saw him say, oh, and he was so physically upset that he was not going to follow this chain of command anymore. The president of the United States, doesn't meet his standards. So he says, well, I don't need to listen to that president of the United States. He doesn't know what he's talking about, and he overrules him, with the help of his friends. But the point is that if he hadn't overruled them, then the HCQ would have been readily available, would be now, and we'd have a whole lot less sick people and a whole lot less people dying of this pandemic, whatever you want to call it. And I think that is something to be absolutely called out. As we call out Dr. Malone, and I see Mark's here, and so glad to have you with us, Mark. These people have lost their medical attitude. They're not there as healers, as David just said. They're here. They're pursuing some other agenda that somehow is more important to them than the Hippocratic Oath. I can't believe it, and I say shame on them. That's all I can do.
Well, I've mentioned a couple times, and I don't know if people remember, but my grandma on my dad's side has a long history of medicine at the University of Michigan. And, that's always been a very hard, subject for me, because my grandma is the one that I, liken to like my dad's experience with his mom being like you with your dad.
Mhm.
She passed away when he was a freshman in college, and she was a chemist, from the University of Michigan. Her brother, dad, and grandfather were all medical doctors from the University of Michigan. And, again, just circling back with the history of U of M, I do worry about like what my family was into. They all died weird and young. To throw in to make it even more harder is that, they were from Steubenville, Ohio, which, we've talked about the history of Steubenville. Even so, a character in history that most people don't know, but I think is really key is Edwin Stanton, who was the Secretary of War under Lincoln, that, basically demoted McClellan, and basically took over the Northern Army. His backstory is like my mom's family. His dad was a doctor from Steubenville, Ohio, and he was a lawyer in Cincinnati, which is near Steubenville. But I know I know my grandma was doing stuff with blood transfusion. She was doing clinics at Case Western in Cleveland, which is one of the original programs that Vannevar Bush and Compton set aside with the universities. It was one of the first 5 or 6 schools was Case Western, and then University of Michigan was one of the next round. So again, I never met her. She died in 1966, but I do look at the history of people that come from sort of the University of Michigan. They really stick with me. That's why, like, Dr. Francis Collins, I really, he sticks out. And then Dr. Gupta, Sanjay Gupta, also being a U of M background. Another character, on the dark side, which they really got a lot of PR, was the Sackler family with their Purdue Pharmaceuticals, and people, know the story about the murder in Canada. But when Professor Hamamoto was getting into this, Loretta Bender, who was working, she was working out of a place called Creedmoor, which was a mental institution in the Bronx, and then she was also at Bellevue Hospital in New York City. But the Sackler brothers were doctors at this Creedmoor, and people that are into firearms will know about the Creedmoor. They had all the riflery competitions there before they built the hospital. But the Sackler brothers, there were 3 of them. They were doing the original electroshock therapy. They were doing the experimentation with LSD. Loretta Bender was giving LSD to children, to what were considered problem children. But there's we all, learn about the horrors of Germany in World War II and the medical experimentation that happened there, which, is terrible. But I just worry that we are running parallel programs in the United States, to some degree, which, maybe not the same, sort of result, as far as the end of the war. But I really do, worry that there was, sort of, linkages between these hospitals. And again, it's getting into the same Rockefeller Foundation. They were sponsoring these programs, and they were, sending scientists and students from American universities to Kaiser Wilhelm Institute, and back and forth. And, I don't want to be the one that really scrutinizes different heroes of people like an Albert Einstein, who was a doctor or who was a chemist at Kaiser Wilhelm. But the other one that really sticks out for me is the Terre Haute, Indiana that's very close to where my mom's family is from, and my grandma Key, she was a student at Indiana State Teachers College in Terre Haute, and that was where a man named Chaim Weizmann, who was the first president of the nation of Israel, he was a considered the father of mass. He was making ammonia, a lot of ammonia, mass fermentation, but he had a company called Commercial Sullivan's Company, and he was living, he had fled Germany during World War II and ended up in London and was very close with Churchill. But he started his Commercial Solvents Company in Terre Haute, Indiana, of all places. So Terre Haute is also famous for what's called the Vigo Ordnance Factory. And the Vigo Ordnance Factory was where the United States was making anthrax and botulism, and then providing that to the British Army. That was shut down in the whole 71. I think they got rid of the offensive chemical and biological weapons program, but there was they also had an affiliation with the Delco company, and the Delco is the Dayton Electronic Company, which was founded by Charles Kettering, who became the main kind of engineer at General Motors, which again, General Motors and DuPont were the same company in that era. And then also a guy named Ralph Deeds, and then a Talbot, I forget, Richard Talbot maybe, who was the uncle of Strobe Talbot. And those guys ended up getting into the Dayton Project, which did the plutonium enrichment and also the explosive lens. And that was called the Dayton Program, and it was a subset of the Manhattan Project. Talbot's brother-in-law was a guy named Thomas, who was the chief chemist for Monsanto. So there's a lot, and again, the Delco group they all came from National Cash Register, where Angleton's dad was, working for the Italian version of National Cash Register with Patterson, which becomes Wright-Patterson Air Base with a lot of the paperclip people. Delco was using the Vigo Ordnance Factory for part of their work. And we know Kettering was, they named Sloan Kettering after him, but he was also a big leader in fuels and in the tetraethylene, and that was a joint venture with General Motors and with Standard Oil of New Jersey, which was Esso, then Exxon. So there's a lot of I don't know. I mean, we've all been taught, that the Americans are the good guys and we beat the bad guys, but there's just a lot of really dark, bad parts that again that we that Cham Weissman, like, I don't want to just go off on one specific country, but he started the research institute in Israel, and his first person to be the chief chemist was Fritz Haber. He died before he could take the position, but he had been hired to be the head of the Weizmann Institute. So there's a lot of dark parts of war and history, and it's hard for me because, again, like, a lot of these GM and Ford and Chrysler characters are people that I grew up with around anyway. A lot of them live in my area, and so it's I've talked about it. I mean, I try to tell as much as I can and really get to the roots of it. But again, it does seem to, circle back to, even characters like William Harvey, who was, part of the Jam Wave, and he was doing operations in those PB successes. He was from Indianapolis, but his mom was a professor at Indiana State. And then even more recently, you have Jamal Khashoggi, who was in the news for being a Washington Post reporter that was murdered at the Saudi embassy in Turkey. He was a grad student at Indiana State. So everybody thinks of Larry Bird being, Bird versus Magic at Michigan State. But, I don't know, my grandma was a fourth grade teacher. She never talked much about, Terre Haute. I've never been there. My uncle was from there, but it's it's just it's just hard because, again, like I keep circling back to, like, I don't want Indiana and Michigan to be in Ohio to be like the cradle of all this bad stuff, but it is.
Yeah, you have to look into the European side of it to really understand the connection between Rockefeller, Carnegie, Cold Spring Harbor, the eugenics project. And then, as we've read in a number of books, how the American Wall Street financiers were financing the worst parts of the Kaiser Wilhelm Institute and the Institute for, I think it's called Brain Studies. And these are the people that were, sending out orders to the SS saying, hey, we need some subjects for our next experiment, and so they will just go and kill them and bring them up there for their experiments, or not kill them, whatever is necessary for the good of medicine. They had this idea that we're doing all this, it's not, it's nothing personal, we're not doing a lobotomy on you to be mean to you. We're doing it for science, and we have to do this because we're scientists and that's what we do. And if we didn't do it, then nobody would do it, and the earth would never progress, and we'd all still be rubbing two sticks together to make a flame. That's their thinking, is that progress is necessary, and you can't make an omelet without breaking some eggs. And boy, are they willing to break some eggs and some humans at the same time. It's not easy to talk about. It is unspeakable, but it is what we have to do. But don't think that it's all centered in Michigan or Ohio or Indiana or even Steubenville, if that's how you say it. But those creepy ideas have been everywhere. They certainly didn't start in the New World. They started in Europe, and these it really does boil down, as I've said many times. If you really believe that humanity is just bad, and it's all, everybody's evil and bad, like the Calvinists would say. That's what Helen Dulles would tell you. Unless you are saved, you're worthless. You're worse than worthless. You're a useless eater. And somehow or another, they've been able to internalize that belief and pass it on through generations, so that they just kind of instinctively think that, well, of course, those people down there in Guatemala, they're worthless. We might as well just do it. I mean, the best thing that could happen for the people of Guatemala would be they could contribute something to science, because other than that, they're just going to live out their little poor land, pushing their plows around and patting their donkeys, and it's worthless. It's a worthless life, this rural, boring. That's what the Dulles brothers really were after, was to get excitement going on, do something, make things happen, push things along. And boy, they didn't care if people got killed. And matter of fact, I think creating war was a lot more a part of what they wanted to do than stopping war. It seemed like their whole foreign policy was geared toward continuing to keep wars going on. here we are with more and more wars. It doesn't get better as long as we're under the control of this blob or the synarchy or whatever the latest name for it is. But I do think we've got to stop trying to say it's Russia against America, or China and Russia against America, or Russia against China, or the Democrats against the Republicans, or any of that. It's nonsense. It's all got to be focused on, there is this huge financial power that has gone completely out of control, run by psychopaths, and it's eating everything up, like Pac-Man going around just eating everything. And that's all they do. It's like a computerized destruction machine. And although there are human being faces on it, the bottom line is it is a machine, and it will destroy everything. It's a monumental problem that is, and boy, is it difficult to talk across the aisle to the other side. I don't care which side you're on; it's awfully hard to reach across there. I've told you, I think, about one of my favorite YouTubers. It goes by the name of Tick, T-I-K, and he's a military analyst, and he's doing wonderful work on World War II, and particularly the Battle of Stalingrad, which ended today, on February 2nd, 1943, when General Paulus surrendered the German Sixth Army, and 100,000 starving German soldiers finally gave up. One of the most important events of the 20th century. That's February 2nd, 1943. But what he was saying was, he has a terrible time with getting criticized because he doesn't accept the socialist view of things, the Russian, the USSR view of things in the war, and people argue with him and tell him he's a capitalist and he's a fascist and he's a Nazi and all of these, because he has his own view. But he pointed out something that I think maybe is important to consider. He said that from a socialist point of view, the hardest thing to understand, it's easy to understand why rich people vote for Republicans or the conservatives in Britain. It's easy to understand. They're protecting their own interests, and that's the system that has enriched them, and they want to keep on getting rich, and they really don't really care that much about the rest of humanity because it's working well for them. But what's really troubling and hard for the liberals to understand is, why would a poor person vote for the conservatives? Why would somebody that's a working class person actually vote for a Donald Trump? It's against their best interest. They know, that the conservatives are all about enriching themselves. If you are trying to work your way up the ladder and you realize that it's not working, they're never going to let you up into the big money. And so why don't you just accept the fact that you really shouldn't vote for these capitalists, these conservatives, these Trumps. And the problem from the socialist point of view is simply, there's only two explanations for a poor person voting for a Donald Trump. Number one, they want to be a Donald Trump themselves. They want to get into that rat race and make all that money and climb fist over fist to grab whatever they can. And that's their philosophy of life is get all you can. And so they might be poor now, but they want to be the next Donald Trump. That's why some poor people would vote for Trump. And the other reason is just because they're stupid. They're just too stupid to not vote for Trump because they saw some commercial, or they fell in love with some televangelist, and they're just easily led. They're stupid people. And those two things, I think, really do constitute a huge barrier, where why can't you see that it's possible that people that are voting for the conservative side, the Republican side, are doing it for some reason other than they want to be, the next capitalist phenomenon, or they're just dumber than a bag of hammers. And that's the one that I think is a big challenge. You know what I mean?
Well, as you know, I'm not somebody that has ever really been inspired by any political candidate of my lifetime. I, watched Saturday Night Live and felt like I got insights on their characters from watching it, as silly as it sounds. Um, I'm just not, I don't know. I'm just not it's hard for me because I really think that the candidates, like, I really, like to get deep into their backgrounds. And, um, as you were, I think, very correctly saying, criticizing Stephen Kinzer for kind of wrapping a bow on the Dulleses and being like, well, that's just, the American system. And, we're the capitalists, and the capitalists are just sort of the gung ho, and, we take what we want, and, we deserve it. Well, it- Alan Dulles was one of the founders of Mary Carter Paints and Resorts International. He partnered with Meyer Lansky in that, with the people that end up doing the Iran Contra and doing the Safari Club and the BCCI Bank. That's all the roots from Dulles, and Donald Trump's the man that bought that organization, in 1987. And just before this show, I was going over Felix Sater again, because there's so many characters to know. And I did remember correctly. He was the guy that, stabbed a guy in the face with a broken wine stem, and was, the bagman for, Simeon Mogilevich, the man that they sort of, they did the whole pizza connection, was Rudy Giuliani rounding up the, the five families of New York, the French Connection group. And then they brought in the Russian crime gangs to sort of fill the void of the now locked up, from Rudy Giuliani, the locked up Italians. And Sater's one of the bagman guys for that. And so, I'm just, I went to school with people that probably are friends with Trump's kids from UPenn and Georgetown and stuff like that. I've never met them, but I'm just not, I just feel like none of the backstories of anybody is talked about. I knew people that went to Stanford with Chelsea Clinton, people that lived in Chappaqua where, the Clintons moved. So, when I see these candidates, and then the closest one is the Romneys. Mitt Romney went to Cranbrook, and Scott Romney, his brother, lived a street away from me. His daughter is the head of the RNC, at this very moment. She literally lived 7 houses away from me. And, her dad was a fraternity brother with he was a Psi at Michigan State. And, again, I hate circling back on this stuff, but my mom's friend Pam, that married the president of the Psi, his grandpa was the one that was the chief chemist for Park Davis, who was the advisor to Neil Gordon, that did the Gibson Island research conferences by you in Maryland. He was the chief chemist. Neil Gordon was at Wayne State University in Detroit. He initially did those conferences at Hopkins, but then he moved them down to Gibson Island. But Mr. Merker's son and daughter-in-law are the ones that fixed up my parents. That when my grandma died, my dad dropped out of college after his freshman year. He was destroyed by it, and he started working for my grandpa at the dry cleaner. And my mom was a education major from Michigan State, and she was doing student teaching in Birmingham, and she was a 21-year-old teacher, and she got fixed up by the Merkers with my dad. And the Park Davis was we've looked at the picture of the baby at the Diego Rivera fresco in the DIA. Well, the people that founded the DIA were the Scripps and Booths, and that was, my dad's childhood friend was Peter Booth, and his grandparents started Cranbrook, the school that all those people went to. So, it is it's hard because, again, like my dad, really struggled, and he never talks about it, but he went to the Gauss School, which was a boarding school for dyslexic kids in New York by Buffalo, and his classmates were Peter Booth, whose grandparents were the Scripps Booth, and then his other classmate was Pete Knutson, and Pete Knutson's dad was William Knutson, who was the person that did the mass production. I mean, look at, he worked for Ford in the 1915 to 1925, then GM. Then he was hired by Bernard Baruch to do the basically the industrialization of mass production for the war effort. It's again, like, I don't know what to think of it all, because it is like, again, it's like, my dad lost his mom, my grandpa, his dad died in 1930. When he was 14, he ended up going to ingesting a peanut and had a collapsed lung, and he ended up going to the Trudeau Sanitarium in Lake Sarnac, New York, which is right next to where what was called Knollwood. And the reason I know Knollwood is because it's a golf club in Bloomfield Hills. And that was the name of the camp that people like Lewis Marshall, who was the law partner with Samuel Untermeyer and with the Guggenheims, and then the Guggenheim that founded the Jet Propulsion Lab in Pasadena with Caltech. That was the same family, and the place when he was 14 living in the Iron Lung, he was right next door to their camp on Lake Sarnac. So, again, I hate taking stuff so personally on all this, but it's hard to go through it. But I mean, I guess it's it's the double edge that it makes, so I can remember a lot of the characters because I knew them, or my family is associated with them or whatever. But it's the other thing too is the penicillin was from Peoria, Illinois, was where they mass produced the penicillin, which was the sort of the cure for the for those awful syphilis experiments. Was a cantaloupe from Peoria was what they found to be the best subject to make mass produced penicillin, which was a big a really big deal in the history of medicine and in war fighting. It was a big something they really made. I don't even know how many tens of millions of doses of penicillin they made from that, but we all focus on Kaiser Wilhelm, and yes, they had Fritz Huber, who was the father of poison gases and everything that was there. And he was, doing horrible stuff in World War I. Before that, my grandpa had a uncle that, was ruined by poison gas from World War I and lived a miserable, painful life in Indiana. But the other one too is Dulles' grandpa, the John Foster Watson, is from Petersburg, Indiana, which is literally 5 miles from Princeton, where my grandparents are from, Princeton and Patoka. So again, nobody ever made connections of these people to me. I know if Dulles is really Douglas, the last name, that would be possible, because my, great grandma was a Douglas that had a horrible, burned up and burned to death after my great grandpa died in a car accident in 1930. so it's, people, I it's again, like I try to fill in a lot of the information, but as we've sort of talked about, it's very hard for me to go through it all because so many of the characters, even like my nephew who's in a student at Cranbrook right now in first grade, his classmates are my classmates that are, we talk about United Fruit Company. Well, Max Fisher was the one that kind of took over United Fruit Company when Eli Black went flying out of the Pan Am building and killed himself. Max Fisher was the one that slid in that role. And Max's grandfather and the grandfather of my classmates founded Vesco Oil, which, if you know your Iran Contra, Robert Vesco was the business partner of Donald Nixon, the nephew of Richard Nixon, who also was a business partner with Prince Philip, the Dutch prince. So there's a lot, in there. I mean, I know that nobody can follow it all, but I try to keep posting it to give the background on people.
You just tied a lot of things together. I love you connecting it to Prince Philip there, which Dulles to Prince Philip makes a lot of sense. Putting in Resorts International, it adds an interesting twist when people consider that is one of the points on which Donald Trump is often attacked, saying well, this results in Resorts International and mafia and all. Hey, they're all involved in the mafia. Everybody is, and the CIA in particular. And that's one of the things we've discovered in our studies is that it's real, and it's got its tentacles. To quote Frank Perdue, they have long tentacles, he said, and that's why he invited them to help negotiate with the chicken farm workers in Maryland back in the 80s. Long tentacles, very useful to business, indeed. Dark stuff, and Dave, and thank you so much, because you do have a unique position, and I think you've identified many family members who have at least some of them would have been nefariously gotten rid of. This is happening right and left. The more I study this stuff, the more it seems like, number one, as soon as somebody learns something that they're concerned that you might spill it, well, you die, And the other thing is, if they've let you in on something and you offhandedly speak of it to somebody, then you die. And if they've sent you on some mission that they just really want to get done, and so you finally get it done, but now they don't need you anymore, so you die, like Lee Harvey Oswald. It's so many cases of people just dying, and you've got a number of possible ones to study if you wanted to. But more importantly, what you're showing is that my story's not unique, your story's not unique, and people all around this country are going to see that they have the same things, those mysterious deaths that really shouldn't have happened. Well, they shouldn't have happened. And if you look underneath of it, you may very well find that that person, was somehow had gotten some knowledge they shouldn't have gotten, or somehow they had spoken of something they shouldn't have said, or just they got used and then they were done with them, and so they did, what George calls a Dumbo dumping with young women, for instance, when they get done with them. It's a horrible thing, the unspeakable. And when it hits your family, man, it is hard. But thank goodness we're here. We can tell people about it, and with your experience and everyone else's, we have to convince the world that this is real, and we can't be messing around with this any longer. stop ruining our families, stop ruining our future. And so, yeah, thanks for sharing.
Welcome. Yeah, again, it's just, I feel like we're just drilled with the same themes over and over, and it's hard for people to accept that the CIA is made up of a good percentage of Galen organization people, and that, that was the way it was created. It was a joint venture from the beginning. And to just say, oh, it was, just German paper clips that were brought in and they were the only bad ones. And how could we let the bad ones? Well, no, it was a joint venture from the beginning.
Yep.
It was partnerships. And like you said, some people were, willing, some were done, some did what they had to do based on, threats to their families or
Yep.
anything. I mean, obviously there was a lot of intellectual, people focus on the gold and, those resources, but there was a lot of intellectual property that was being stolen and then, rebranded or given, attributed to new people. And so there was a lot of, that's how I see Paperclip was a lot, taking a lot of what you said, the old European, mechanical, electrical engineering and, secrets of war and manufacturing techniques and things like that were being brought into the United States, but they didn't want to, give credit to the people from, that had historically done that. And I think it applies to the, even the medicines. You were talking in the beginning about, the Z-Pak and the HCQ. Well, from what I've read, they had quinine going back to Hans Sloane. That's 18th century. He got, from a bark in Jamaica. So, I did have the great uncle that went to the brother of my great grandfather William's name was Milton Underdown, and he was Cornell Agricultural School also, which is, a red flag to begin with. But he died in Brazil in 1907 of yellow fever. So, was he, doing sanitation projects, which I think he might have been, because he, based on who he worked for the Undersecretary of War, William Carey Sanger. Elihu Root was the Secretary of War in that year. 1902 and 1903 was when he worked for Sanger, but he was supposed to be doing experimental farming. So is that bioweapons, to go down to Brazil? He was working for the Brazilian government. I don't know. I'm like open, but of course it does make me think, United Fruit and, the whole Rockefeller, Henry Ford had his big Fordlandia plant in Brazil, which was the inspiration for the Brave New World, was that Fordlandia plant. So there's a lot of, I just feel like people, are very trained to believe, because horrible things happened. Like we've said, families were destroyed, but, just blaming one person or one country is very hard to overcome, because, even now it's, they want to say, oh, well, Russia is, they're the aggressive country, and, they're threatening the Ukraine, and, one boot steps into Ukraine and it's a war now. I mean, it's just like, it's crazy. And, if it's just to cover the fact that Anthony Blinken, was a student under Donald Barr, and his dad was a, Warburg Pincus investment banker, and, has the Blinken Library in Bucharest that George Soros started, that, has all the old records of Alan Dulles' Voice for America. If it's to cover that, and then his stepdad is, Robert Maxwell's lawyer. I mean, is that where we are, where we're literally going to threaten like a war? I mean, sadly, I think we will. Nobody wants to fess up to any of this stuff, even though it's pretty easy to find it. It's not hard to, draw the connection that Bill Barr's dad, Donald Barr, was a, OSS Columbia guy. They named the Manhattan Project after Columbia. So I don't know. It seems, you know, again, like I study this stuff all the time, and I try to watch, you know, really outstanding presenters like you and George and Mark. You know, I really like Professor Hamamoto's information as well. But, you know, I feel like it's hard to overcome the ingrained messaging. And then again, people have their, you know, their own families tell them the stories of their families and what they, you know, even people in the chat will, you know, will say, oh, well, you know, the Russians did this to my family, or the Germans did this to my family. And, you know, there's no breaking that because that was what their grandparents told them. So it's hard, you know, it puts you in a very hard situation to try to sort of understand the mess.
Yeah, blaming it on one person, and when we were talking about the horrible medical experiments, that certainly were not only in Germany, they were in American hospitals and still are, I believe, and certainly farmed out to places like Canada and at McGill, where the horrible experiments were done on in so-called treatment. With electroconvulsive therapy and with adrenaline and all kinds of mind control techniques. Terrible, terrible stuff. But I was thinking of Ilse Koch, the woman, the infamous wife of the commandant of Auschwitz, who you know, was famously tried for all of these horrific things with the lampshades made of human skin and all of that stuff. She was made the poster child for a horrific Nazi. You know, she's like, oh, who did this? Oh, it was the horrific Nazis. Oh, Ilse Koch. Oh, she's horrible. You know, and then you see the horrible picture with the swastika, and there she is. And that whole thing, I think, is an example of exactly what you were saying, that
Yeah.
all of those horrible experiments, and you know, they're all focused on one person, this one Ilse Koch, who was this she devil of Auschwitz, whatever they called her. They had various, you know, names for her, but that's it. They made a Lee Harvey Oswald out of her, and this is exactly right. That's what they will do, and the news just goes right along with it.
Yeah.
Oh, who are we blaming for this one? Oh, we're blaming this person for that. Okay, got it. You know, run with that story at 6:30. Well, it's been a pleasure again, David. Thank you.
All right. Thanks so much, John.
All right, everybody. Thanks for you being with us. I appreciate the chat. And as usual, I will read the whole chat as soon as the show's over and enjoy your comments. Thanks again. Good night, everybody.